The men came at dawn, and they didn't knock. Three of them pushed through Clara Whitmore's door like they owned it, because in their minds, they already did. The tallest one, a red-faced man named Garrett Holt, walked straight to her fireplace and warmed his hands without looking at her. "We're here about the land," he said. "Your husband's dead. That means his claim died with him." Clara stood in her nightgown, barefoot on frozen dirt, watching him touch the stones her husband had laid with his own hands. Garrett finally turned around and looked her over, all of her, and something ugly crossed his face. "A woman like you?" He almost laughed. "What exactly were you planning to do out here alone?" If you've ever been told you were too much, too big, too plain, too ordinary to matter, then this story was made for you. Stay until the end. Subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning her husband died, Clara Whitmore was boiling water. Not because she had anything to put in it. There was nothing left to put in it. She boiled water because she needed something to do with her hands, because the alternative was sitting beside Edmund's cot and listening to the sound his breathing had become, shallow and wet and wrong, in a way she couldn't fix. She'd been listening to that sound for 6 days. She'd learned to hate it, and she'd learned to be grateful for it. And now, just past 4 in the morning on the 9th day of February, the sound stopped. Clara stood at the stove for a long time after she realized it. She didn't scream, she didn't collapse. She just stood there with the ladle in her hand and the pot bubbling and the cabin cold in a way that wood couldn't fix. And she waited for some feeling to arrive that would tell her what she was supposed to do next. It took a while. Edmund Whitmore had not been a bad man. That was the thing nobody in Harlow Creek would ever understand, because bad men were simple. You could hate them clean and clear and move on. Edmund had been something harder than that. He'd been hopeful in the way that costs other people. He'd read books about Wyoming, about wide-open land and new beginnings, and he'd convinced himself, and then Clara, that a man of his particular determination could build something real out here. He believed it. That was the terrible part. Right up until the fever took him, Edmund Whitmore believed they were going to make it. Clara had believed him once too. She wrapped him herself. She didn't have enough fabric for it to be right, and the ground was too frozen to dig, so she did what she could. She moved him to the cold room at the back of the cabin, and she said the words she remembered from her mother's funeral 20 years ago, and she went back to the stove and stood there until morning came. The fire was almost out by then. She hadn't noticed. She had 2 pounds of dried beans, half a sack of flour that had gone slightly gray at the edges, 4 potatoes that were more eyes than potato. The woodpile outside was down to what she could carry in one trip, and the nearest settlement, Harlow Creek, 12 miles east through country that didn't care whether she lived or died, had exactly 1 general store and a population that had made their feelings about Clara Whitmore clear before she and Edmund ever left for the mountains. "You're not cut out for this," Edmund's cousin Roy had said the morning they loaded the wagon. He hadn't said it mean, which was almost worse. He'd said it the way you tell a child the stove is hot, like he was doing her a favor. Roy's wife Martha had stood beside him with her arms folded, looking at Clara's frame with that particular expression women like Martha saved for women like Clara, the look that said too big, too soft, won't last the first winter without ever having to say any of those words out loud. Clara had smiled and climbed up onto the wagon seat and said nothing. She thought about Roy's face now, standing at her dying fire, and used the memory like fuel. She got the fire going again. It took 4 tries and the last of the good tinder, but she got it going. Then she sat down at the table. The one Edmund had built crooked because he was better at dreaming than carpentry. And she made a list of what she had and what she needed and how many days she could stretch one into covering the other. The math was not encouraging. She could last maybe 18 days on what was in the cabin, if she was careful, if she rationed hard, if nothing went wrong. In Wyoming, in February, something always went wrong. Imsat. The first person from Harlow Creek came on the 4th day after Edmund died. Clara heard the horse before she saw it. Horses made a particular sound in deep snow, a muffled, laboring thud that carried differently than anything else. She was at the window before she'd decided to move. It was Garrett Holt. She knew him by the way he sat a horse, like he was doing the animal a favor by riding it. Garrett Holt owned 300 acres in the valley below, a cattle operation that wasn't half as profitable as he pretended it was, and a mouth that never stopped reminding people of both. He was 45 and red in the face in all weather, the kind of man who treated every conversation like a negotiation he'd already won. He brought 2 men with him, brothers by the look of them, the Crane boys, Dale and Fitch, who hired themselves out for the kind of work that needed doing when a man didn't want his name attached to it. Clara didn't open the door right away. She watched them come up the path, such as it was, barely a track through the snow, and she set down the ladle she'd been holding and picked up the rifle instead. Edmund's rifle. She'd never fired it at anything but a tin can, and she'd missed the tin can more often than she'd hit it, but Garrett Holt didn't need to know that. She opened the door before they knocked. Garrett pulled up short when he saw the rifle. Just for a second, just enough for Clara to see it, and then his face rearranged itself into something that was supposed to look sympathetic. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Heard about Edmund. Terrible thing. What do you want, Mr. Holt?" He swung down off the horse like she hadn't spoken. "We've come to help you. Couple of the men can take your things back to town. Get you set up somewhere warm." "I'm warm," Clara said. This was almost true. The fire was going. "What do you want?" Garrett Holt walked toward her door like he'd been invited. Clara didn't move out of the doorway. He stopped, looked at her, then he looked at the rifle. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice shifted, the sympathy drying up fast. "Let's not make this complicated. You're a widow woman alone on a mountain in February. Your husband's claim on this land, and I'm sorry to be blunt, but it needs saying, that claim doesn't transfer to a wife. Not under the current filing, which means this land reverts. And I've already spoken to the county office about—" "My husband filed a joint claim," Clara said. "My name is on the paperwork, both our names." Something moved across Garrett Holt's face. Not quite surprise, more like irritation that she knew that. "Be that as it may," he said. "Be that as it is," Clara said. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd get back on your horse, Mr. Holt, because I've had a very hard week, and I'm not in the mood for this conversation." Behind him, Dale Crane smirked. Fitch looked at the ground. Garrett Holt looked at Clara for a long moment. At her face, at her frame, at the rifle she was holding without any particular grace, and something settled in his expression. Something that said, "This isn't over," without saying it. "You won't last," he said. And he said it the same way Roy had said it back in Harlow Creek. Not mean, just factual, like he was reading weather. "Maybe not," Clara said, "but today's not the day I don't." She held the door until they rode out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down on the floor next to the crooked table and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. The rifle had not been loaded. She'd checked that morning. Days blurred after that. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists in deep winter, in a place where you can go days without seeing anything move. Not silence exactly. Winter was never silent. There was always wind, always the creak of the cabin settling against cold, but a stillness that pressed in. Clara learned to fill it with work, because the alternative was thinking, and thinking too long led to places she couldn't afford to go. She rationed the beans. She stretched the flour. She cut the potatoes so thin you could see through them and made a soup that was mostly water but had enough substance to keep her moving. She took Edmund's coat over her own when she went outside for wood, and she hated herself a little for how much warmer she was with his extra layer, hated how practical grief made you, how quickly the body started making use of things the heart wasn't ready to release. She thought about Roy's face. She thought about Martha's arms, folded tight. She thought about every shopkeeper in Harlow Creek who'd looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't belong. Not cruel exactly, just absent of welcome. She thought about Garrett Holt's voice. "You won't last." She got up every morning and lasted another day. By the 12th day, the woodpile was so low she was rationing that too, burning only enough to keep from freezing and wearing every piece of clothing she owned in layers that made her feel like a badly assembled quilt. The beans were down to what might be 3 meals if she was creative about it. The flour was gone. One potato left, and it had given up any pretense of being a potato. That night, the temperature dropped to something she didn't have a number for. The cold came through the walls like it had been waiting for permission. Clara lay in the dark and listened to the wind and did the math again, the way she'd been doing it every night, moving the numbers around, hoping they'd change. They never changed. 18 days had become 12, and 12 had become now, and now looked a lot like the end. She was not afraid of dying exactly. What she was afraid of was Garrett Holt being right. She fell asleep sometime before dawn, still wearing Edmund's coat, and she dreamed about nothing. Bam. The sound woke her before the light changed. Something heavy, just outside the door. A shifting of weight on the porch boards. A sound that was too deliberate to be an animal and too quiet to be an approach that meant her well. Clara was awake and sitting up before she'd fully processed any of it, and she had the rifle off the wall before she remembered it wasn't loaded. She stood in the middle of the cabin, holding an empty gun, and waited. A knock. 3 times. Hard. Not Garrett Holt's knock. She knew his knock now. She'd been dreading it for days, the way it pushed against the door like it was already assuming entry. This was different. This was just a knock. "Who is it?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Silence. Then, Silas Crow. She didn't know the name. She didn't recognize the voice either. Low, flat, no particular invitation in it. "What do you want?" "Brought wood," the voice said. Clara stood very still. "Why?" A pause, like the question was unexpected. "Saw your smoke. 3 days ago you were burning hard. Yesterday you weren't." She thought about that. Someone had been watching her smoke, not in a malicious way it seemed, just in the way a person watches things on a mountain, because things on a mountain have a pattern, and when the pattern changes, you pay attention. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "How do I know you're not one of Holt's men?" Another pause, longer this time. "You don't," he said. "But if Holt sent me, he sent me with 200 pounds of firewood and a dressed-out mule deer, which doesn't match what I know about Holt." Clara looked at the empty rifle in her hands. She looked at the fireplace, where the coals had gone pale. She thought about the math she'd been doing every night, the numbers that never changed. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was nothing like what she'd expected, though she hadn't been sure what she'd expected. He was big. Not Garrett Holt's particular kind of big, which was a man who'd been strong once and kept the size without the strength. This was different. This man looked like the mountain had made him. He was probably 50, give or take years that hard living could add or subtract without consulting the calendar. Dark beard, going gray in patches. Eyes the color of the creek in November. Not a comfortable color. He was carrying 2 enormous armloads of cut wood like they weighed nothing, and there was a deer carcass roped to the porch rail behind him that would have taken Clara 20 minutes to drag from the tree line. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. "You were going to bluff me with that," he said. Not a question. "I was going to try," Clara said. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. "Fair enough," he said. "Can I come in?" He didn't talk much. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Most men she'd known filled silence like it owed them something. Roy, Edmund, Garrett Holt, all of them with words enough for 3 conversations happening at once. Silas Crow brought in the wood without commentary, stacked it against the wall with a methodical care that suggested he'd been doing this particular motion for decades, and then turned to the deer and started breaking it down with a knife that had clearly been his longer than most of Clara's furniture. She watched him work. She'd watched Edmund try to butcher a deer once, the year before they'd come west, and it had been educational in the way disasters are educational. This was different. Silas moved through the animal like he was reading something, every cut purposeful, nothing wasted. "You live up here?" Clara asked. "Yes." "For how long?" 11 years. She waited for more. None came. "Trapping?" "Some." He glanced up. You're Clara Whitmore. Your husband filed on this piece last April." "You knew Edmund?" "Saw him twice. Waved. A pause, the knife not stopping. He didn't know what he was doing. The soil here's wrong for what he planned. Too thin. The water table drops in dry years. Clara felt a complicated feeling move through her, something between grief and a kind of tired recognition. He was better at dreaming than planning, she said. He knew that about himself. He knew it. He just didn't let it stop him. Silas looked at her for a moment. That a criticism? No, Clara said, and she meant it. It was the best thing about him. The storm came the second night, and it was serious. Clara had felt weather enough by now to understand when the sky was working up to something. There was a particular quality to the air before a bad storm, a heaviness that pressed down, and she'd felt it all afternoon. She'd said nothing. Silas had said nothing either, but he'd made 2 extra trips to the woodpile before dark, and he'd checked the windows in a way that told her he'd felt it too. By midnight, it was a full blizzard. The wind came from the north with the kind of conviction that makes you think of the word assault. The cabin held. It was solidly built, whatever Edmund's other failures, but the cold that came through despite the fire was something Clara felt in places she hadn't known could get cold. Silas sat in Edmund's chair. Clara had offered it without thinking, and he'd taken it without ceremony, and looked at the fire. "You're going to stay," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "No choice in it," he said. "Can't go out in this." She made what she could with the deer meat and the beans, which was more than she'd been able to make with anything in 2 weeks, and they ate across from each other at the crooked table without much talking. Silas ate the way he did everything, completely, no fuss. After a while he said, "You made the beans stretch." "I've had practice lately," Clara said. He looked at her. "How long were you rationing?" "Since about day 3. Something shifted in his face. Not pity. She'd learned to recognize pity, and she didn't see it. More like a recalculation, the kind you do when something doesn't match your initial assessment. "I should have come sooner," he said. "You came," Clara said. "That's more than most people." They talked that night in the way that storms make you talk. Not because either of them was naturally inclined toward conversation, but because the alternative was sitting alone with your thoughts while the wind tried to peel the roof off, and that was worse. Clara learned things about Silas Crow in pieces, the way you learn things about a place by walking through it rather than looking at a map. He'd been a surveyor once, a long time ago, before Wyoming, before the mountain. He'd had a wife in Ohio, a daughter. He said their names once, Margaret, Eliza, and didn't say them again, and Clara understood without being told that she shouldn't ask. Something had happened. The shape of the silence around those 2 names was grief, and grief like that, 11 years deep, had its own particular weight that she recognized because she was carrying a newer version of it herself. "Why'd you stay up here?" she asked. "After whatever... Why'd you stay?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I didn't trust myself around people," he finally said. "After. I made decisions I couldn't. I did things that..." He stopped, started again differently. "I needed to be somewhere that didn't require me to be any particular thing. The mountain doesn't have expectations." "People are harder," Claire said. "Yes." "I know that feeling," she said. "Being somewhere you don't fit, where everyone's already decided what you are." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he hadn't quite let himself yet, taking her in fully and not making it apologetic or loaded or anything other than a man looking at a person he was trying to understand. "What'd they decide you were?" he asked. Claire almost laughed, but it came out more like the sound you make when something stops hurting and you didn't know it was hurting until it stopped. "Too much," she said, "in every way they could think of. Too big, too quiet, too plain. Not what a woman's supposed to look like." "Who decides that?" "Everyone," she said. "All at once. And then they all agree, and then it's just true. It becomes the thing about you." Silas was quiet for a moment. "What do you decide you are?" he asked. Clara looked at the fire. "I haven't finished figuring that out yet," she said. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. like it was the only kind of answer that made sense. Neither have I, he said. Amot. The storm lasted 3 days. By the second day, they had established a kind of order without discussing it. Clara handled the food and fire management. Silas handled the structural things, clearing snow from the roof load, checking the walls. They moved around each other in the small space with the careful efficiency of people who had learned to manage their own edges. Clara caught herself watching him work sometimes and then looking away, not because she was embarrassed, but because there was something she wasn't ready to examine yet. On the third day, Garrett Holt's name came up. Silas asked what the man had wanted, and Clara told him. The land claim, the two brothers, the conversation that had felt like the opening move in a game she hadn't agreed to play. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He'll come back," Silas said. "I know. He's tried this before. Other widows, other claims. He knows the county filing system better than the county does. He said my name isn't valid on the joint claim." "He's wrong about that," Silas said. "I know the man who filed Edmund's paperwork. The joint claim is binding. Holt knows it's binding. He's betting you don't know that." He paused. "Or he's betting you'll be gone before winter's over." "He's been betting I won't last since before I got here," Claire said. "What do you want to do about it?" It was such a direct question. The most direct anyone had asked her about anything in longer than she could clearly remember. Not what should we do, not what do you think, but what do you want? She sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to hold this land, and I want to not give Garrett Holt the satisfaction of being right about me." Silas looked at her steadily. "That's two different reasons," he said. "One of them's better than the other." "I know," Clara said. "I've got time to work on it." When the storm broke, it broke clean. The sky went from blizzard to blue in less than an hour, the way Wyoming weather sometimes did. All or nothing. Silas went out to check the roof and the woodpile and came back in with his beard full of snow and his hands red from cold. "I need to get back to my place," he said. Clara nodded. She'd known this was coming, had been knowing it, had spent the last day preparing herself for the particular quiet that was going to follow him out the door. "Of course," she said. "You've done more than—" "There's something I want to show you first," he said. He took her up the mountain. Not all the way. The snow was too deep for that, but far enough that she could see the shelf where his cabin sat, tucked into the rock face in a way that made it invisible unless you were looking for exactly the right angle. From a distance, you might take it for a boulder formation. That was intentional, he told her. 11 years of intentional. He didn't take her inside, he stood beside her in the snow and pointed out the storage cache, the smoke path, the direction from which danger most often came. He explained the layout of his trap lines and where the deer ran in hard weather and what plants stayed green under snow if you knew where to look. Clara listened to all of it and understood she was being given something. She just wasn't sure yet what to call it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the cabin, his cabin, the place that had been entirely his for 11 years, and something in his face was working through a calculation she couldn't follow. "Because you're going to need to know it," he said. "If something happens to me, if you need to come up for supplies, if—" "Silas," he stopped. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked again. Slower. He turned and looked at her. The sun was off the snow, and it was very bright and very cold, and she could see his breath, and she could see him trying to find language for something that had perhaps never needed language before. "I've been alone for a long time," he said, "and I've been telling myself I chose it, that I needed it. And maybe I did, for a while. But I watched you hold that door against Holt with an empty rifle, and then sit down on the floor when he left and breathe until you stopped shaking, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought, that's not a woman who needs saving. That's a woman who needs—" He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the flat top of the fence post beside them. A ring. Copper, hand-hammered, rough around the edges, and clearly made by someone who'd learned the skill from a book rather than a teacher. Clara stared at it. "I'm not good at people," Silas said. "I don't know how to say this right. I've been out here long enough that I'm not sure I know how to say much of anything right anymore. But what you are is exactly—" He stopped and started again differently. I don't need someone to cook for me or clean for me. I've been doing that myself for 11 years. I don't need someone who's helpless. I need... His voice dropped. Almost a whisper, the kind the wind could take. Marry me, he said. Clara stood in the snow on the side of a Wyoming mountain with the cold burning her face and her hands, and looked at the copper ring and at the man who'd come down the mountain with firewood when her smoke went wrong. The woman who'd been told her whole life that she was too much, too big, too plain, too ordinary for anything that mattered. She heard a man say she was exactly what he needed. She couldn't speak for a moment, couldn't find the shape of any words that would fit what was happening inside her. The grief that was still there, the exhaustion that was still there, all the winters she'd already survived, and the winters still ahead, and this rough copper ring on a fence post in the snow. She picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Warmer somehow from being inside his coat. She looked at him, at his face, which was not a comfortable face, not a reassuring face, just an honest one. And she nodded. She couldn't make words yet. She just nodded and felt the tears come without being able to stop them, and watched something in Silas Crow's eyes shift into something she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked, for the first time, like a man who had decided to stop leaving. She wore the ring back down the mountain. She hadn't put it on right away. She'd held it in her fist for most of the walk, feeling the weight of it against her palm. The rough edges where Silas had hammered the copper into shape without quite enough patience or skill to make it smooth. At some point, without deciding to, she'd slipped it onto her finger. It was slightly too large. It turned when she walked. She kept catching it with her thumb to hold it in place, and she didn't mind the inconvenience of it at all. Silas walked ahead of her on the trail, breaking path through the new snow the storm had laid down, and neither of them spoke for a long time. This did not feel strange. That was the thing Clara kept noticing. The silence between them didn't have the uncomfortable texture of silence that needed filling. It was just two people moving through cold air with a lot to think about. She was thinking about Edmund. She couldn't not think about Edmund. He was still in the back room of the cabin she was walking toward, and she was walking toward it wearing a copper ring on the hand that had held his during his last coherent hours, and grief and something else entirely were occupying the same space inside her chest in a way that felt indecent and also completely human, and she didn't know what to do with either of them. She thought about what Silas had said. I don't need someone who's helpless. Not a romantic declaration, not pretty language about her eyes or her heart or her inner beauty. Just a plain statement from a plain man who had watched her manage a crisis and decided she was someone worth standing next to. It was the least flowery proposal she could have imagined. It was also, she realized, the first time anyone had ever proposed something to her on the basis of what she could do rather than despite what she was. Silas, she said. He stopped and turned. They were almost back to the cabin now, the crooked structure visible through the trees. I need to tell you something. Before we go any further with this. He waited. I'm not going to be easy to live with, she said. I have opinions. I don't shrink down because a room wants me to. I've been told that's a problem. He considered this with the same flat expression he applied to most things. I've been alone on a mountain for 11 years, he said. I need someone with opinions. Someone quiet is just going to make the silence worse. I also cry sometimes, she said. Not for show. It just happens. All right? And I'm not going to pretend I'm not grieving. I won't put that on you, but I won't lie about it either. Clara, he said. What? I asked you to marry me, not to be someone different than you are. He turned back toward the cabin. I know what I asked. She followed him the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than before, lighter somehow, like something had been set down. They buried Edmund the following morning. The ground was still frozen too hard for a proper grave that would have to wait for the thaw. But Silas had a knowledge of the mountain that included, apparently, a knowledge of what to do when the earth wouldn't cooperate. He built a cairn. It took most of the morning, the two of them moving stones in the cold, and they didn't talk much while they worked because there wasn't much to say. When it was done, Clara stood and looked at the pile of rocks and said Edmund's name twice, quietly, and then turned away because standing there longer wasn't going to help anything. He would have liked you, she told Silas on the walk back. Silas thought about that. Why? Because you know things, practical things. He respected that. She paused. He would have asked you 40 questions about trapping and taken notes, and then immediately done something different from what you told him. Something in Silas's expression shifted, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. Sounds like a particular kind of man, he said. He was, Clara said. He was exactly that particular kind. The days that followed had a strange, doubled quality. On one hand, Clara was a widow in the middle of winter with a dead husband barely 2 weeks behind her and a land claim being circled by a man who wanted it. On the other hand, she was also, apparently, engaged to a mountain man who came down every second or third day with game and firewood and occasionally stood in her kitchen and told her things about the mountain in that flat, methodical way of his, like he was uploading 11 years of accumulated knowledge because he'd decided she needed to have it. He taught her about the trap lines first. Not how to run them, not yet, but where they were, how they connected, what the land looked like between each one. He drew her a map on the back of a piece of brown paper, and it was not a beautiful map. His drawing was functional at best, but she could read it, and she committed it to memory the way she'd committed everything useful she'd ever learned, by going over it in her head at night until it sat solid. "What's the fastest route to your cabin from here?" she asked one afternoon. He told her. "And if the snow's too deep on that route?" He told her that too. She added it to the map in her head. "You're preparing for something," he said. "I'm always preparing for something," Claire said. "I've learned not to wait until I need to know things to start knowing them." He looked at her with that recalculating expression she was starting to recognize, like she kept coming back slightly different from what his estimate had predicted. "Who taught you that?" he asked. "Nobody," she said. "I taught myself. It's the kind of thing you learn when people aren't giving you information they assume you won't need." He was quiet for a moment. "People assume that about you." "People assume a lot of things about women who look like me," Claire said. "Flat? Not angry. Just the way you state a thing that's been true for so long it stopped requiring emotion to describe. That we're slow, that we're simple, that we can't handle information or hard work or hard weather, that we're soft all the way through." "You're not soft all the way through," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "I'm not." Well, Garrett Holt came back on a Tuesday, or what Clara estimated was a Tuesday. Days of the week had become approximate out here, and this time he came with a piece of paper. She saw him coming from the window, the same window she'd watched him ride up from before, and she felt the same tightening in her chest she'd felt then. But it was different now. She had more information than she'd had before, and she had Silas's voice in her head, steady and factual. "He's wrong about that. The joint claim is binding. He knows it. He's betting you don't." She opened the door before he knocked, the same as before. She did not have the rifle this time. She didn't need the prop. Garrett Holt looked surprised to find her looking the way she looked. Solid, rested, not the barely surviving widow he'd clearly been counting on finding. He recovered quickly, arranged his face back into its performative sympathy. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Still holding on, I see." "Mr. Holt," she said. "You've got something in your hand." He held up the paper. "Had the county office draw this up. Given that you're alone out here and winter's far from over, I wanted to offer you a formal option. Purchase agreement. Fair market value for the claim. Given everything. Let you get back to town, get set up somewhere warm, start—" "Let me see it," Claire said. He blinked. He'd expected something else, argument maybe, or fear, or the kind of overwhelmed gratitude that would let him walk her through the document at his own pace with his own explanations of what it said. He had not expected her to just reach out and take it. She read it. She took her time reading it. She was aware of him standing on her porch with his horse breathing behind him and the Crane boys a few steps back, and she didn't let any of that awareness speed up her reading. The number was insulting. The claim was worth 3 or 4 times what he was offering, even accounting for the difficult access. But more than the number, there was a clause at the bottom, the language winding and careful, that would transfer not just the land, but any improvements made to it and any water rights associated with it, including the creek that ran along the eastern edge, the creek that fed half the valley below. Clara looked up. "This isn't about the land," she said. Garrett Holt's face didn't change, which told her everything. "The water rights," she said. "That's what this is about." "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know what—" "My husband didn't know about the water rights," she said. "He didn't know that the creek up here connects to the valley supply. He just knew it was a pretty creek." She held out the paper. "I know. So does Mr. Crow." Something went cold in Garrett Holt's eyes. Not dangerous. She didn't read it as dangerous, not yet, but the performance of concern was fully gone now, and what replaced it was the face he used when he was doing business rather than playing at neighborliness. "Crow," he said. "You've been talking to Silas Crow." "He's my neighbor," Clara said. "We talk." "He's a crazy hermit who's been living up here too long to—" "He's someone who's been on this mountain for 11 years, Clara said, and who knows exactly what flows where and why, and who has, I'll point out, been here long enough to have watched you try this particular move before." She folded the paper in half. "With the Mercer widow, and before that with the Hollis family after the father died." Garrett Holt was very still. "I'm going to keep this," Clara said, holding up the folded paper, "because I think it might be useful later. You have a good day, Mr. Holt." She went back inside and closed the door. She stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, listening to the sound of him not moving on the porch. Then the sound of boots on steps. Then horses moving away through snow. She sat down at the crooked table and put her head in her hands and breathed until she stopped shaking. It happened every time. She could be completely steady all the way through and then fall apart the moment the door closed. She was starting to think that wasn't weakness. That was just the body collecting what it was owed. When Silas came that evening, she showed him the paper. He read it the way she'd read it, without rushing, without reacting to the number. When he got to the bottom, to the water rights clause, he set the paper down and was quiet for a long moment. "He'll come back differently next time," he said. "I know. The paper won't be enough. He'll bring someone with a legal title, or he'll create a competing claim. He knows people at the county office." "You said you know the man who filed our paperwork," Clara said. Silas looked at her. The word "our" sat between them, and she'd said it without thinking, and neither of them acknowledged it, but she felt it land. "Tom Briggs," Silas said. "He's in Laramie, honest man, old. Can we write to him?" "Already did," Silas said. Clara stared at him. "When?" "Day after the storm broke. I knew Holt would be back. Sent the letter with the Pedersen boy. He makes a run to Laramie once a month." He paused. "I asked Briggs to confirm the joint claim in writing and to note the water rights attached to the eastern boundary." Clara sat back. She looked at this man sitting at her crooked table, this man who barely said 3 consecutive sentences most of the time, who had been quietly doing chess moves on her behalf without announcing any of them, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before Edmund got sick. She felt like she had a partner. "You could have told me," she said. "You didn't need to worry about it until there was something to worry about," he said, "or until you needed to know. You didn't need to know yet." "I like to know things," Clara said. "I said that." "You did?" He almost looked apologetic. Almost. "I'll remember that." "See that you do," she said. But it came out softer than she meant it to, and he heard the softness in it, and for a moment they were just 2 imperfect people at a crooked table with a piece of Garrett Holt's bad intentions folded between them, and something in the room was warmer than the fire could account for. She asked him about Margaret and Eliza on a night in late February when the wind was bad enough that he'd stayed again, and she asked, not because she was ready for the answer, but because she felt he was carrying something he'd been carrying alone too long. He was quiet for so long after she said their names that she thought he was going to refuse. She was prepared to accept that. "Margaret was sick," he finally said. "A long time. I kept thinking, I kept being told she might get better. That if I made enough money, if I moved us somewhere with better doctors, if I—" He stopped. The pause was long. "Eliza was 7 when her mother died. 8 when I made the decisions I made." He put his hands flat on the table. I thought working more was the same as taking care of them. I was away surveying a job 6 days when there was an accident at the house. He stopped again, completely. Eliza was 8. Clara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She put her hand over his on the table, and he looked at her hand there for a moment like it was something he'd forgotten the language for. I came out here because I didn't know how to be in a world where I'd done everything I thought I was supposed to do, and it still ended that way, he said. The mountain doesn't ask you why you're here. No, Clara said. It doesn't. You lost someone too, he said. Recently. Yes. Is it? He stopped. Does it get better? I've never asked anyone who was close enough in time to still know. The question undid her a little. In a private way she kept mostly internal. The idea of this man, 11 years removed from his grief, asking her, 2 weeks out of hers, what it was like while it was still happening. Like she was the expert because she was still inside it. It doesn't get better yet, she said honestly. It just changes shape. Right now it's everywhere. I think at some point it becomes something you carry rather than something you're drowning in. She paused. That's what I've been told. I'll let you know if it's true. He turned his hand over and held hers. Not romantically, not with any particular intention, just held it, the way you hold something when the weight of a conversation requires you to anchor yourself to something physical. I should have told you about the letter, he said after a while. Yes, Clara said. I'm used to making decisions alone. It's a habit. I know, she said. I know it is. We're going to have to work on that. Probably, he agreed. And there was something in the way he said it, the probably, with its admission that working on things was indeed a thing that would be happening, that felt more like a commitment than the proposal in the snow had. Because the proposal had been an impulse, maybe, or a decision made suddenly in a moment of clarity, but probably was the long game, probably was a man who was planning to be around long enough to have habits worth changing. The letter from Tom Briggs came the 3rd week of March, carried up the mountain by the Pedersen boy who was 16 and thought delivering correspondence to the strange trapper and the widow was the most interesting part of his month. Briggs had written 2 pages in a careful old hand, and the substance of it was, the joint claim was fully valid, the water rights were attached to the eastern boundary and had been since the original filing, and any attempt to contest this would need to go through Laramie, where Briggs himself would be happy to appear and explain the paperwork in terms even Garrett Holt's friends at the county office could understand. Clara read it twice. Then she read it to Silas, who listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance with the look of a man running calculations. He'll find another angle, Silas said. He always does, Clara said, but this angle is closed. For now. For now, she agreed. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the tin box where she kept the important papers, Edmund's name on the deed, and their marriage certificate, and now this, the document that said she had the right to be here, the right to stay, signed and witnessed and dated in a way that even Garrett Holt would have difficulty arguing around. Spring's coming, Silas said. Clara looked out the window. The light was different. She'd been noticing it for days, the particular shift in the quality of afternoon sun that meant the season was thinking about turning. How long? Weeks, maybe a month. What changes when spring comes? He thought about the question. Everything gets harder before it gets easier, he said. The thaw makes the trails bad. Mud season. Then the work starts. If you're going to put anything in the ground, you need to prepare now. He paused. And Holt moves faster in spring. Winter slows him down same as it slows everyone else. Then we move faster too, Clara said. Silas looked at her. We, he said. Not a correction, not a question. Just the word, weighted with everything that had accumulated in the past weeks, all the storms and firewood, and shared tables and hands held for the right reasons at the right moments. You said it first, Clara told him. I did, he agreed. And you meant it? He looked at her for a long moment with those November Creek eyes. I meant it, he said. Every part of it. Outside, the afternoon light came through the window at a new angle, the first suggestion of spring hidden inside February's last cold push, and Clara Whitmore, Widow, landowner, woman who had been told her whole life she was too much, sat at her crooked table with a copper ring on her finger and a letter that said she had the right to stay, and decided that meaning it back was the most reasonable thing she'd done in months. Spring came the way it always did in Wyoming. Not gently, not as a gift, but as a negotiation between two seasons, neither of which was ready to concede. The snow pulled back from the lower trails first, leaving mud so deep it could take a boot hole if you weren't careful about where you stepped. The creek along the eastern boundary of Clara's claim ran fast and cold with snowmelt, loud enough that she could hear it from inside the cabin on quiet mornings, and she found herself listening to it differently now that she understood what it meant. Not just a pretty creek, a lifeline. Holt's real target. Silas moved his things down from the upper cabin in early April. He didn't make a ceremony of it. One morning he arrived with a pack that was heavier than his usual visits accounted for, set it inside the door and said, "I figured it was time." Clara looked at the pack and then at him. "Your cabin?" she asked. "It'll keep," he said. "I'll go up every week or so, check the traps." He said it like it was practical, like it was just logistics. She understood it was also the most significant thing he'd done in 11 years. She made room for his things without commenting on how little there were of them. A man who'd lived alone on a mountain for over a decade had stripped himself down to what mattered: tools, 2 changes of clothes, a collection of hand-drawn maps she couldn't fully read yet, and a small tin that he set on the shelf above the fireplace without explaining what was in it. She didn't ask. What she noticed was that the cabin felt different with someone else's weight moving through it. Not better, not worse. Different. Edmund had moved through spaces with a kind of restless energy, always heading toward the next thing, the next idea. Silas moved like someone who had learned to be exactly where he was. It took some adjusting to, the way you adjust to any new sound in a familiar room. They were married on a Thursday in the second week of April. There was no preacher within 20 miles, and neither of them was inclined to make the trip just for ceremony. Silas had asked Tom Briggs, in the same letter he'd used to confirm the land claim, whether a witness declaration would hold in Wyoming territory, and Briggs had written back that it would, provided it was signed and witnessed by a third party of standing. The Pedersen boys' father, Henrik, was a man of standing. He owned the largest farm in the valley and had lived in the territory for 30 years and was, crucially, someone Garrett Holt actively disliked, which Clara found she appreciated as a bonus. Henrik Peterson came up the mountain on a Thursday morning with his wife Astrid, who brought a jar of preserved plums and hugged Clara with the uncomplicated warmth of a woman who had decided Clara was worth hugging and wasn't going to ask permission about it. Clara, who had not been hugged by anyone in 2 months, held on a beat longer than she meant to. "You're too thin," Astrid said, pulling back and looking at her with sharp Scandinavian appraisal. "I was rationing," Clara said. "No more rationing. You eat." Astrid pressed the plums into her hands. "And you?" She turned to Silas, who was standing to the side with the particular stillness of a man who had not anticipated being hugged by anyone. "You look the same as always, like a tree that forgot to have a personality." Silas blinked. Henrik laughed, a short bark of it. "She says this to everyone. Don't take it personally." He extended his hand to Silas, and they shook. The handshake of men who knew each other in the way of neighbors in large country. Not close, but solid. The ceremony itself took 11 minutes. Clara had written out the declaration herself. The language formal because formal language in legal documents was not just decoration, it was defense. Henrik witnessed it and signed his name in large, clear letters. Astrid signed beside him. Silas signed. Clara signed. When it was done, Astrid cried. Clara had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. The plums and the hugging, and a woman she barely knew weeping quietly into a handkerchief while Clara stood in her dead husband's cabin with a copper ring and a legal declaration and tried to hold all the feelings in one place at once. "She cries at everything," Henrik said, not unkindly. "She cried when we signed the deed to the farm. She cried when our mule had a foal." "The foal was very small," Astrid said without stopping. They stayed for the midday meal and then made their way back down the mountain, and when they were gone, the cabin was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, a way that felt like something had settled rather than something missing. Silas was washing the tin plates at the basin. Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked at him doing this ordinary domestic thing and thought about the word husband, which was not a simple word, not a word you could look at without it looking back. "You're thinking something," he said without turning around. "How do you know?" "You go quiet in a particular way when you're thinking, versus quiet because there's nothing to say." She noted this, that he'd already learned to read her silences, already differentiated between them. Edmund had never learned that. Edmund had assumed all her quiet was agreement. "I was thinking about the word husband," she said, "and it's complicated." "Yes," he said. He dried his hands and turned around. "For me, too." "Is it too fast?" she asked. Not anxiously, just honestly. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, fully, before speaking. "It's not slow," he said, "but I don't think fast and wrong are the same thing necessarily. Depends what you're doing and why." He looked at her directly. "Why did you say yes?" She'd expected, if he asked at all, that he'd ask it differently, more defensively. This was just a plain question. "Because you looked at me like I was a whole person," she said. "Not a situation to be managed, not a burden, not a shape that needed apologizing for." She paused. "And because you were making a plan, you weren't guessing. You'd been thinking about it, and you decided, and you asked. That matters to me. Impulses fade. Plans are different." He nodded slowly. "I thought about it for 3 days before I asked," he said. "What happened 3 days before?" "You told Holt the joint claim was valid, and then closed the door in his face," he said. "I watched it from the tree line. I'd come down to check on things, and I saw him ride up, and I stayed back because I didn't want to interfere if you were handling it." A pause. "You were handling it." Clara absorbed this. "You were watching. Not in a, I wasn't spying. I know," she said. "I understand." And she did. She understood that a man who'd spent 11 years on a mountain watching everything, because watching everything was how you stayed alive, would have watched, and that watching her handle Garrett Holt without flinching had told him something he needed to know. "Did you know then?" "I started to suspect," he said, which, from Silas Crow, was probably as close to a romantic declaration as she was going to get, and she found she was entirely satisfied with it. Mud season made everything harder in the specific grinding way that mud season always did. The trails turned to soup. The woodpile required constant replenishing because wet weather burned through wood faster, and hauling wood up from the lower stand was twice the work in mud. Claire's boots, already not well suited to this country, gave up any pretense of keeping water out, and she spent 3 days with perpetually wet feet before Silas disappeared for an afternoon and came back with a pair of moccasins he'd made from deer hide, handed them over without comment, and went back to what he'd been doing. She wore them until they fell apart months later. She also started running the South Trap Line with him. Not because he'd asked her to, he hadn't, but because she'd looked at the map in her head and at the amount of work one person couldn't reasonably do and made the calculation herself. The first time she showed up beside him at the first trap, he stopped and looked at her and said, "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "Show me how." He showed her. He was a better teacher than she'd expected from a man of so few words. He was precise, patient without being condescending, and he had the useful teaching habit of explaining why before explaining how. She learned fast. She'd always learned fast when someone bothered to explain the reasoning. The problem was that most people, looking at her, hadn't thought the reasoning was necessary. What she hadn't anticipated was how physically demanding it was. The trapline covered 6 miles of broken terrain, and Silas moved through it at a pace she could match but not easily, and by the end of the first full run, she was sore in places she hadn't known could get sore. She didn't say so. She went inside and sat down and didn't get up for 20 minutes, and when Silas came in and looked at her sitting there, he said, "You should stretch your legs out when you stop. Helps the muscles." "Now you tell me," she said. "I should have said before." "Yes, you should have." She stretched her legs out. "Tell me things. I keep asking you to tell me things." "I forget other people don't already know what I know," he said, with the faint expression of a man making a genuine admission about a genuine flaw. "Add it to the list," Clara said. "What list?" The list of things we're working on. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. She was collecting these sounds, the almost laughs, the not quite smiles, the brief shifts in his expression that meant something specific had landed with him. She was building a vocabulary of Silas Crow, the same way she'd been building a vocabulary of the mountain, careful and incremental and paying attention. Well, Garrett Holt's next move came in May, and it was smarter than the paper. He sent a man named Aldous Webb to file a competing claim. Webb was a land speculator from Cheyenne. Nobody local knew him, and he appeared at the county office with documents suggesting that Edmund Whitmore's original filing had contained an error in the boundary description that made the entire claim invalid. It was careful work, the kind of careful work that required someone who understood the paperwork well enough to find a seam in it. Clara found out from Henrik Peterson, who'd heard it in town on a supply run. He came up the mountain to tell them, which was the kind of neighbor he was, and he sat at the crooked table and laid out what he'd heard while Astrid sat beside him and looked at Clara with an expression that mixed sympathy with something more useful, anger on someone else's behalf. Boundary error, Silas repeated when Henrik finished. His voice was flat in a specific way that Clara was learning meant he was furious. That's what Webb filed, Henrik said. Whether there's actually an error or whether they manufactured one is something only someone with the original survey notes could say. The original survey notes, Clara said slowly. Silas looked at her. Tom Briggs mentioned the survey, she said. In his letter, he said he'd done the survey himself, that it was in the county record. She paused. If the survey is in the record, and if the boundary description in the survey matches what Edmund filed, then Webb's competing claim is based on a manufactured error, Silas said. Which means it's not just aggressive land speculation, Clara said. It's fraud. The word sat on the table between all four of them. Henrik looked at Silas. Can you get to Briggs? If I leave tomorrow, Silas said. I'll go, Clara said. Every head at the table turned toward her. I'll go to Laramie, she said. I'll take the letter Briggs sent us, and I'll take the copy of our declaration, and I'll go explain to him in person what's happening. She looked at Silas. You need to stay here. If you're gone and someone decides to move on the cabin while we're both away, you don't know the route to Laramie, he said. Then tell me the route. It's 4 days on horseback in good conditions. Then I'll need food for 5 days in case conditions aren't good. Clara. Silas. She said it the way she'd said his name on the mountain in the snow, when she needed him to hear her rather than just listen. I can do this. Tell me I can't do this. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the argument in his head, testing it for places where he could stand, finding that the argument stood. You can do it, he said. I don't want you to. Those are different things. I know they're different, she said. I know you don't want me to, but wanting me to be safe and needing this done are also different things, and right now we need this done. He stood up from the table and went to the window. Clara let him stand there. Henrik and Astrid exchanged a glance that was too married to fully translate to anyone outside the marriage. I'll go with her, Astrid said. Everyone looked at her. Henrik needs to stay for the farm, she said, completely serene. I don't. I've been to Laramie twice. I know the route. She looked at Clara. You shouldn't go alone. Silas turned around from the window. He looked at Astrid with an expression that was as close to gratitude as his face could manage. That's... he started. Good, Astrid said. It's settled. We leave tomorrow. Yet, they left before dawn. Silas had spent the evening preparing everything. The horse, the pack, the food, the documents in a waterproof oilskin sleeve that he'd made himself and pressed into Clara's hands with specific instructions about which pocket it would be safest in and under what circumstances she should reference it, and to whom. She listened to all of it. She knew he was managing his own fear by turning it into logistics, and she found this more touching than she had words for. At the door, in the gray light just before sunrise, he stopped her. I keep thinking of things I should have told you already, he said. Tell me when I get back, she said. I'm going to make a list. Something warm moved through her chest. You're going to make a list, she repeated, so I don't forget. She reached up and put her hand against his face, the beard rough under her palm, and he stood very still under her hand like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without it meaning loss. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know," he said, and then quieter. "I need you to." She rode out with Astrid Peterson at first light, the mountains behind them, the long trail to Laramie ahead, and she did not look back because she knew that if she looked back at Silas Crow standing in the door of the cabin, she would feel something large enough to slow her down, and she could not afford to be slowed down. Not yet. The road to Laramie was hard in the way Wyoming roads were always hard, not dramatic, not the spectacular danger of mountain passes, just the grinding, accumulating difficulty of distance and weather and terrain that never quite flattened out. Astrid was a better rider than she looked, which was something Clara noted and filed. The older woman sat her horse with the easy assurance of someone raised to it, and she talked, which Clara found she didn't mind. Astrid talked the way some people breathed, not because she was nervous, but because she was genuinely interested in the world and found silence a waste of good air. She talked about her children, 3 of them grown now and scattered across the territory. She talked about Henrik and how he'd been when they'd first come to Wyoming, young and scared and too proud to say so. She talked about the land in a way that Clara recognized, not as property, not as investment, but as something you entered into a relationship with. "It takes you seriously if you take it seriously," Astrid said on the second day, and Clara wrote that sentence in her memory because it applied to more than just land. On the third night, they camped in a shallow valley with good tree cover, and Astrid made coffee over a fire that she built without drama, and they sat across from each other in the firelight, and Astrid looked at Clara with those sharp, direct eyes and said, "He loves you, you know." Clara wrapped her hands around her tin cup. "It's early for that word." "Is it?" Astrid looked unbothered by the pushback. "I've seen that man 3 times in 11 years. Every time he looked like someone who'd decided the world had nothing left in it for him." She paused. "He looks different now." "He's the same person he was." "People don't change," Astrid agreed, but they open up sometimes, like a door that's been stuck." She drank her coffee. "You opened the door." Clara thought about Silas at the window, working out his fear by counting her food rations. Silas handing her moccasins without making her ask. Silas saying, "I need you to," in a voice that cost him something. "He opened it himself," Clara said. "I just happened to be there when he did." Astrid smiled at her cup. "That's a generous interpretation." "He'd say the same about me," Clara said. "He'd say I opened up myself and he just happened to be there. We'd probably argue about it." "Good," Astrid said. "Couples who can argue about credit are generally doing all right." Tom Briggs was older than Clara had pictured from his letters, somewhere past 70, with hands that had written 10,000 surveys and showed it. He received them in his office on a Friday afternoon and listened to everything Clara said without interrupting once, which she found deeply refreshing. When she finished, he held out his hand for the documents. She gave them to him. He read them the way serious people read important things, slowly, going back over sections, making small sounds to himself that were not directed at her. Finally, he set them down. "Aldous Webb," he said. "You know him?" "I know of him," Briggs said. "He's worked this kind of claim dispute 3 times in the last 4 years. Eastern Wyoming, mostly. He finds widows or confused heirs, manufactures a procedural problem, and offers to buy at a loss before the dispute can be resolved." He paused. "He's never had someone come to Laramie in person." "I thought it was worth the trip," Clara said. Briggs looked at her with the particular respect old men sometimes gave to people who surprised them. "The survey notes are in the county archive here," he said. "The boundary description is exact. There is no error." He tapped the paper in front of him. "What Webb filed is, as you've said, fraud. Can you document that?" "I can do considerably more than document it," Briggs said. "There's a territorial attorney here, a man named Gould, who has been looking for exactly this kind of case to establish precedent against Webb and the people who employ him. I believe I know who employs him," he added in a tone that was not particularly surprised. "The name Holt means something in these conversations." Clara sat very still. "Holt is behind Webb's filing." "I can't prove it yet," Briggs said carefully, "but I'd be surprised if I couldn't." He folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Crow, I'd like to write some letters. And I'd like to ask you some questions about what you've observed on that land, the water flow, the access routes Holt has been pressing on. Would you have time to stay a few days? Clara thought about Silas alone on the mountain, watching the trail. She thought about the list he was making of things he wanted to tell her. She thought about Garrett Holt and how long he'd been betting on her not lasting. "I have time," she said. She was gone 9 days in total, not 5. She sent a letter with a rider heading north after the 4th day, so Silas would know she was all right. And she spent the extra days with Briggs and the attorney Gould, going over everything she'd observed since February. Holt's visits, the water rights clause in his purchase offer, the pattern Silas had described of previous widows and previous claims. Gould took notes in a precise hand and asked questions that told her he was building something, laying timbers for a structure that wasn't visible yet. When she finally turned her horse north toward home, she had a letter from Gould confirming the survey and an affidavit from Briggs attesting to the validity of the original filing, and a separate document that she carried in the inner pocket of her coat close to her chest because it was the most important of all of them. A formal complaint lodged with the Territorial Land Office naming both Aldous Webb and, with careful qualified language, Garrett Holt as parties of interest in a pattern of fraudulent claim disputes. She rode hard the last day, Astrid matching her pace without complaint, and she came up the mountain trail in the early evening with the light going gold behind the peaks, and the creek loud with late snowmelt, and the cabin visible between the trees with smoke coming from the chimney. Silas was at the door before she reached it. He'd heard the horses. He always heard things before other people did. He looked at her for a long moment when she pulled up. Just looked, taking inventory the way he did, checking that she was whole and in one piece and present and real. "You're late," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll tell you everything. There's a lot." "Are you hurt?" "No." "Tired?" "Extremely." He came down off the porch and took the horse's bridle and looked up at her with those eyes that had learned to say more than his mouth generally allowed. "I made the list," he said. She climbed down slowly. She was going to feel those 9 days for a week, and stood in front of him in the early evening light. "How long is it?" 12 things, he said. "Things I should have told you already." She took his face in both hands, the way she'd done at the door before she left, and she felt him go still the same way, the stillness of a man relearning what it felt like to be someone's home. "Tell me inside," she said, "and tell me slowly. I want to hear all 12. He walked the horse to the post, and she followed him to the porch, and at the door he stopped and held it open for her. This man who had spent 11 years making sure no one needed to do that for him, holding a door open like it was the most natural thing. And she walked through it into the warmth of the fire he'd kept burning every night while she was gone, because some things don't need to be said to be understood. The 12 things on Silas's list took 3 evenings to get through, not because there were too many of them, but because some of them required conversation around them, and conversation with Silas had always moved at its own pace. He would say a thing, and then there would be silence while both of them turned it over, and then one of them would say something back, and the talking happened in that rhythm rather than the continuous flow most people used. Clara had stopped finding this frustrating somewhere around the 3rd week of knowing him. Now she found it restful, the way you find a pace restful once you stop fighting it. The 12 things were practical mostly. Trapline adjustments he'd made while she was gone, a problem with the roof on the east side that needed addressing before the next heavy rain, the location of a medicinal root he'd been meaning to show her that grew along the creek bank. But some of them were the other kind of practical, the kind that required more than logistics. He told her about a man who'd come up the trail while she was away, claiming to be lost, who Silas had given water and directions to while carefully noting that the man had looked at the cabin with more attention than someone genuinely lost would bother with. He told her he thought the man was Webb's, sent to survey the property. He told her, on the 3rd evening, that he'd been afraid while she was gone. He said it the way he said most things, flat, facing forward, not looking at her. "Not afraid you couldn't handle it," he said. "Afraid of the parts you couldn't control, weather, strange men on the road." A pause. "I kept checking the trail." "I know," Claire said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because it's what I would have done," she said, "if you'd gone instead." He went back to looking at the fire. That's the thing I keep adjusting to, he said. Having someone to check the trail for. Is it terrible? She asked. No, he said. No. She let that be enough. Because with Silas Crow, no, followed by a pause that long, was its own kind of declaration. June arrived, and with it the work that mountain life demanded regardless of what else was happening. The ground had thawed enough to plant, and Clara had spent the week since her return preparing the soil in the flat section below the cabin that got the most sun. It was not easy ground. The soil was thin where Silas had said it would be thin, and it needed amending with compost and ash, and she worked at it with a methodical stubbornness that left her hands rough and her back aching by evening. Silas watched her planning the garden with the expression of a man who was working out whether to offer advice or keep quiet. He kept quiet for 2 days. On the third day, he said, "You're putting the root vegetables too close to the slope." Clara looked at where she'd marked the rows. "The drainage runs that way," she said. "I thought, in a wet summer, yes. In a dry summer, you lose them." He crouched beside her and drew a line in the dirt with one finger. "Move them here. The subsurface stays moist longer." She looked at the line. "How dry does it get?" Dry enough. 78 and 81 were bad. The creek dropped so low I could step across it. She moved the markers. He watched her do it without making it into more than it was. This was one of the things she'd been cataloging about him. The difference between the advice he offered because he couldn't help himself and the advice that was just his version of caring. The root vegetable line was the second kind. He'd made her fix it because he wanted her garden to survive. "You could have told me that 2 days ago," she said. "I wanted to see if you'd figure it out," he said. She stopped and looked at him. "Did I?" "Not quite." But something in his voice made it sound like the almost right was as interesting to him as the right would have been. Well, the hearing in Laramie was scheduled for mid-July. Attorney Gould had moved faster than Clara had expected. He'd been building a case against Aldous Webb for months before she arrived, and her documentation and Briggs's affidavit had given him what he needed to formalize the complaint and request a territorial review. A letter came in June notifying Clara and Silas that they were required to appear as complainants, and that the hearing would also address Webb's competing claim. Clara read the letter twice over breakfast and then set it on the table between them. "Together this time," she said. Silas looked at the letter. "I need to arrange someone to watch the property." "Henrik," Clara said. "Henrik has a farm to run." "Henrik will do it anyway," Clara said, "because he has been waiting for someone to take Garrett Holt to a formal proceeding for approximately 10 years. I watched his face when I told him about Gould's investigation. He looked like a man who'd been promised something." Silas considered this. "He did look like that," he admitted. "We leave in 2 weeks," Clara said. "I'll write to Gould today." He picked up the letter and read it himself. She watched him read it, the way his eyes moved through the text methodically, the small deepening between his brows when he got to the part about potential testimony regarding the water rights. "They're going to ask about the creek," he said. "I know, that's the strongest part of the case. I'm not good at—" He stopped. "I don't talk well in formal situations." Clara looked at him steadily. "You talk well in all situations when you decide to. The problem is you usually decide not to." He made a sound that acknowledged this point without surrendering to it. "I'll need to practice." "Then practice with me," she said. "Tell me everything you know about the Eastern Creek and the water table and where the flow goes in dry years, and what it would mean for the valley if someone controlled that access." He told her. He told her for 2 hours, and the information was dense and technical and specific in exactly the way that made a good witness. Not opinion, not argument, just a man who'd lived on that mountain for 11 years and knew where the water went the way he knew his own face. When he finished, Clara sat back in her chair and said, "You are extremely good at that." "At knowing where water goes?" "At knowing things clearly," she said. "Now do it again, but louder. And look at me when you say it, not at the middle distance." He gave her a look that said he found this process undignified. He did it again anyway. They were 2 days out from Laramie when it happened. They'd camped on the second night at a spot Silas knew, a sheltered flat near a stand of cottonwood, good water nearby, the kind of camp you could set up and break down fast. Clara had been awake before dawn for no reason she could name, some animal alertness that pulled her out of sleep without a sound to attach it to. She lay still and listened. The cottonwoods moved in the pre-dawn wind. Somewhere east, something large was moving through brush. Elk, probably, or deer, the sound too regular to be alarming. She was almost back to sleep when she heard it, a different sound, closer and deliberate. She put her hand on Silas's arm. He was awake in an instant, the way he always was, not gradual, just suddenly present. She felt him still under her hand, listening. 3 men came out of the dark at the edge of the firelight, and they were not trying to be quiet anymore. The one in front was broad and carrying a rifle loose at his side in the way of a man who wanted it seen. Clara recognized neither of the others. She recognized the man in front by the way he walked, a particular aggressive ease, and she thought for a moment it was one of the Crane brothers before she saw his face. It was not a Crane brother. He was older than them and less local. There was a city quality to the way he held himself, someone who'd been sent rather than recruited nearby. He looked at the camp with the practiced assessment of a man who did this kind of work regularly. "Silas Crow," he said. Silas was already standing. Clara didn't remember him standing up. "Who are you?" Silas asked. "We've been asked to relay a message," the man said, "regarding the hearing in Laramie." "Relay it," Silas said. "The message is that it would be better for everyone if the Crow party didn't appear at the hearing." The man said this pleasantly, with the pleasantness of someone who'd said similar things many times. "There are people with significant interest in the outcome who would prefer to resolve the matter without the complication of—" "Garrett Holt," Clara said. The man looked at her. Something shifted in his face. She wasn't what he'd expected to be speaking. "Ma'am," he said. The word was not respectful. "You're here on Holt's behalf," she said. "He's not willing to put his name on whatever you're about to say, so he sent you instead." She looked at the rifle. "And you brought that because you thought seeing it would be sufficient. You weren't planning to use it." The man's expression went complicated. She was right, and he didn't want her to be. "I'm just delivering a message," he said. "You've delivered it," Claire said. "The answer is no. We'll be in Laramie on the 14th. If Mr. Holt wants to discuss the matter before then, he knows where we live." The man looked from Clara to Silas. Silas hadn't moved or spoken since identifying himself, had just stood there with his arms at his sides in the stillness that Clara knew by now was not passivity, but the opposite of it. The stillness of a man who had decided exactly what he was willing to do and was waiting to see if the situation required him to do it. It was apparently an effective stillness. The man with the rifle shifted his weight. One of the men behind him took a half step back. "You're making a mistake," the man said. The pleasantness was gone. "Maybe," Clara said. "You can go now." They went. Clara and Silas stood in the dying firelight and listened to the sound of 3 horses moving away north, and when the sound faded completely, Clara sat down on her bedroll and put her hands between her knees and breathed. "You're shaking," Silas said. "I know," she said. "I'm aware." He sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You did well," he said. "I was terrified." "I know. You did well anyway." She leaned into him slightly. He put his arm around her, the motion stiff and a little unpracticed, but present, fully present. "Do you think they'll actually try to stop us?" she asked. "No," he said. "That was a scare. If Holt wanted to stop us, he'd have done it differently. He's not stupid. He knows that if something happened to us on the road, the investigation gets bigger, not smaller." He paused. "He's scared, Clara. That's what this was. A scared man sending scared men." She thought about that. Garrett Holt, frightened. It was not something she'd been able to imagine clearly before now, the version of him that wasn't certain. "Good," she said. "He should be." She didn't sleep well the rest of that night, and she didn't pretend she did. Silas kept the fire higher than necessary and sat up longer than he needed to, and neither of them commented on either of these things. They arrived in Laramie on the 13th, a day early. Tom Briggs met them at the rooming house where they'd arranged to stay, climbing the steps with the careful dignity of a man whose joints gave him opinions about stairs, but who refused to let those opinions slow him down. He shook Silas's hand and took Clara's hand in both of his and said, "You look better than the last time I saw you." "I've been eating," Clara said. "Good, you're going to need the energy." He sat down in the single chair in the small room and looked at them both. "Gould has found something additional." The something additional was this. Aldous Webb had filed competing claims on 7 properties in the past 4 years. 3 of those claims had succeeded. The landowners had settled rather than fight, taking whatever Holt's money offered rather than endure the uncertainty of a dispute. 2 more had been withdrawn when the landowners couldn't be found, which Briggs said with a careful, neutral tone that made Clara think he meant something he wasn't prepared to say directly. The remaining 2 were still unresolved. Of the 3 properties where the claims had succeeded, all 3 now had water access issues that benefited Holt's cattle operation in the valley. "He's been building this for years," Clara said. "At least 4, Briggs said. "Possibly longer. Gould is looking at earlier cases." "Why hasn't anyone connected it before now?" "Because the victims were scattered," Briggs said. "Different counties, different seasons, a widow here, a confused heir there. Nothing that looked like a pattern until you stood back far enough to see the shape of it." He looked at Clara. "You stood back far enough." "I just knew he was lying about our claim," she said. "I didn't know about the others until Gould told me." "You started the thread," Briggs said. "Gould pulled it." Silas had been listening to this with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between them. "Who owns those 3 properties now?" he asked. "Men connected to Holt," Briggs said. "Associates, shell arrangements." "Can that be unwound?" "That's what tomorrow is about," Briggs said. "Not just your claim, potentially all of it." He paused. "It's a larger hearing than it was when when you visited me in May." Gould expanded the scope. "There are other complainants now. The people who settled are being contacted." Clara sat down on the edge of the bed. She felt the weight of it. Not just their land, their water rights, their winter and their marriage, and the copper ring and the rifle she'd pointed at Garrett Holt's men. All of it connected to something bigger. All of it part of a pattern some man had been running for years because he'd correctly calculated that the people he was doing it to wouldn't be able to fight back. He'd been almost right. "What do we need to do tomorrow?" she asked. "Tell the truth," Briggs said. "In sequence. Start from when Holt first came to the cabin and go forward." He looked at Silas. "You'll be asked about the water specifically, the physical facts of how the creek flows and where. Gould needs that in testimony, on the record." "I know," Silas said. "I know you know," Briggs said. "I'm asking you to say it like you know it, in a room full of people who are watching you, some of whom work for Holt." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I practiced," he said. Briggs looked at Clara. Clara looked at the ceiling. "He practiced," she confirmed. The hearing lasted 4 hours. It was held in a low-ceilinged room in the Territorial Land Office that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke and the specific damp of a building that had been through many Wyoming winters. There were 3 officials behind the table at the front. Gould sat to one side with his careful notes. Several men Clara didn't recognize sat in the chairs along the wall. She clocked them as Holt's interests without being told, something about the quality of their attention. Garrett Holt himself was not there. His attorney was a man named Fitch, no relation to the Crane brother, who had a practiced, disinterested manner and objected to approximately every 5th statement with the efficiency of someone billing by the hour. Clara testified first. She'd prepared for this differently than she'd prepared for anything. Not by rehearsing what to say, because she didn't trust rehearsed language to stay accurate under pressure, but by putting the events in order in her mind, the sequence clear and clean, and trusting herself to say what had happened in the words that came naturally. She started with Holt's first visit, the 2 Crane brothers, the purchase offer with the water rights clause. She described the clause in specific language because she'd memorized it. Fitch objected twice. The officials overruled him both times. When she finished, the room was quieter than it had been. Then Silas testified. He stood at the front of that low-ceilinged room and described the water table of that mountain and the path of the eastern creek, and the downstream connection to the valley supply in the voice of a man who had learned all of it, not from books, but from 11 years of watching it behave. And Clara watched the officials lean forward slightly as he talked, because what he was saying was precise and specific and completely without theater, and that kind of testimony was hard to argue with. He looked at her twice while he spoke, not for reassurance. She didn't think he needed that exactly. More like checking his bearing, the way you look at a fixed point when the ground is uncertain. She looked back. She kept her face steady because he needed steady, not encouraging, not soft, just present and sure. Fitch objected 6 times during Silas's testimony. Every objection was overruled. The preliminary finding came 2 hours after the testimony ended. It was not the final resolution that would take weeks or months as the full scope of Webb's fraudulent filings was examined, but it was sufficient and clear. Webb's competing claim was dismissed. The Crow property claim was confirmed, water rights intact. A formal investigation into the pattern of filings was opened, and Aldous Webb was named as a subject of that investigation, with associated parties to be identified as the investigation proceeded. Associated parties. The careful language of a document that wasn't ready to say Garrett Holt yet, but was building toward it. Gould found them afterward in the corridor and shook both their hands with the restrained satisfaction of a man who had been working toward this for longer than just their case. "This is a start," he said, "not an end. Webb will fight the investigation. Holt will distance himself. It gets slower from here." "But it's moving," Clara said. "It's moving," Gould confirmed. "Because you came to Laramie in May with a stack of papers and explained it to an old man who happened to know the right people." He looked at her with the frank appraisal of someone accustomed to reading reliability in witnesses. "Where did you learn to build a case like that?" Clara thought about it. "Nowhere," she said. "I just knew what I had, and what it meant, and who needed to know it." Gould nodded slowly. "That's usually how it starts," he said. Briggs was waiting outside on the step in the afternoon sun. He looked tired in the particular way of very old men who have pushed past what their bodies recommended for the sake of something they thought was worth it. He looked also satisfied in the particular way of men who have spent their lives building things carefully and occasionally get to see one of those things hold. "Well," he said when they came down the steps. "Well," Clara said. He patted her hand in the way of a very old man who had decided she was worth the gesture. "Go home," he said. "You've done enough here for now." They rode home the long way, partly because the shorter route had associations Clara wasn't ready to revisit in daylight, and partly because Silas knew a trail through the high meadows that he'd never taken anyone else on, and he offered it without much explanation, and she accepted it the same way. The meadows were in full summer color, grasses long and seed heavy, and the light came in at an angle that made the whole landscape look briefly like something that had been arranged. They rode side by side where the trail allowed and in single file where it narrowed, and they talked some and were quiet some. And at one point Silas stopped his horse and pointed without speaking at a hawk hanging on a thermal above the next ridge, and they both watched it until it folded its wings and dropped and was gone. "I want to tell you something," Silas said when they were moving again. "Tell me." "I testified in that room today the way I did because you made me practice," he said. I would have said less. Said it worse." He paused. "I don't know how to say that I'm glad you pushed me without it sounding like you were managing me." "It doesn't sound like that," Clara said. "It felt like it a little, at the time." "I know," she said. "I saw your face when I told you to look at me instead of the wall." She rode in silence for a moment. "Did it help? Looking at me?" "Yes," he said. "You looked like you weren't going to let anything go wrong." "I wasn't," she said. "I was very determined about that." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She added it to her collection. They made camp that night in the high meadows, under a sky that had more stars than seemed reasonable, and Clara lay on her back and looked up at them and thought about the land that was theirs and the water that was theirs and the investigation that was moving slowly in the right direction in Laramie, and about Garrett Holt somewhere in his valley knowing that the widow he'd dismissed in February had gone to Laramie twice now, and both times had come back with something he didn't want her to have. She thought about Roy, Edmund's cousin, standing on that road in Harlow Creek, telling her she wasn't cut out for this. She thought about Martha's folded arms. She pulled Edmund's coat tighter. She still wore it sometimes, in cold camps, and she'd stopped feeling complicated about it. And she looked at the stars and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly, not triumph. Something more settled than either of those. Something that felt like evidence. Evidence that she was, in fact, cut out for this. Beside her, Silas was already asleep because he slept the way he did everything, completely when he decided to. She listened to his breathing for a while, steady and present and nothing like the sound Edmund's had become at the end. Nothing like that at all. She closed her eyes and slept the whole night through without checking what the darkness held. They came home to a garden that had survived without them. Clara walked through it the morning after they returned, still stiff from the road, and checked each row with hands that had learned by now to read soil the way Silas read trail. By feel, by color, by what was present that shouldn't be, and what was missing that should. The root vegetables had held where she'd moved them, exactly where Silas had drawn that line in the dirt with one finger. The beans were climbing their poles with the single-minded ambition of things that don't know they're not supposed to thrive in thin mountain soil. 2 of the squash plants had given up, but 3 had not, and 3 was enough. Henrik had watered twice while they were gone. He'd left a note on the table in his large, careful hand. All quiet. Saw no one on the trail. Astrid sends bread. It's in the tin. Clara found the tin. The bread was 2 days old and slightly dense in the way of Astrid's bread, which tended toward the structural rather than the delicate, and she ate 2 slices of it standing at the window and felt something that took her a moment to identify as uncomplicated gratitude. Not the desperate grateful of the woman who'd opened her door to a stranger carrying firewood in February. Something quieter. The gratitude of a person who had people now, specific people who left notes and bread and watched a trail because they'd been asked to. Silas came in from checking the property and stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Well," he said. "Henrik watered the garden," she said. "Everything held." He nodded like he'd expected this because he'd known Henrik Pettersson long enough to know he did what he said he'd do. He poured water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the basin and then turned around and looked at her with the expression she'd learned meant he was about to say something he'd been sitting on for a while. "Say it," she said. "Holt's going to know the preliminary finding by now," he said. "He'll have heard from his attorney." "Yes." "He's going to come." Clara set down the bread. "To the cabin?" "Not himself. He won't come himself." Silas crossed his arms. "But he's not the kind of man who accepts a loss quietly and adjusts. He'll want to do something, something that isn't on paper, that isn't part of the investigation." "The 3 men at the campsite were that," Clara said. "That was a warning," Silas said. "This will be different. He knows the warning didn't work." She thought about this. She thought about the shape of a man like Garrett Holt, the kind of man who had been winning a particular game for years and had constructed his entire sense of himself around the winning of it. And what happens to a man like that when the game turns? She'd watched Edmund lose things, the money, the good weather, the health, and Edmund had grieved and adapted and kept moving because he was fundamentally oriented toward the next thing. Holt wasn't built that way. Holt was built around what he already had and what he was adding to it. "We need to tell Henrik," she said. "Already wrote the note," Silas said. "The Pettersson boy can take it down tomorrow." She looked at him. "When did you write it?" "Last night, while you were sleeping." She should have been annoyed. They'd had this conversation, the one about him making decisions alone and telling her afterward. She could see in his face that he knew this, that he'd known it when he wrote the note, that he'd done it anyway because old habits moved faster than new resolutions sometimes. She decided this was not the moment for the conversation about the conversation. "What did the note say?" she asked. "That we were back, that the hearing went well, that they should be careful about strangers on the low trail for the next few weeks." He paused. "And that Astrid's bread was very good." "It was dense," Clara said. "She doesn't need to know that." Dad. The waiting was the hardest part. It always was. And Clara had done enough waiting in the past year to have developed strong opinions about its particular misery. The way it made every sound significant and then made you doubt your own significance reading. The way it sat in your chest like something swallowed wrong. She managed it the way she'd managed everything since February, by working. There was always work. The garden needed it, the cabin needed it, the trap lines needed it, and the accumulation of all the small necessary things added up to days that moved at a reasonable pace if she kept her hands busy enough. Silas managed it differently. He got quiet in a specific way that was distinct from his regular quiet, a watchful stillness. His attention always fractionally pointed toward the trail, the way a compass needle is always fractionally pointed north regardless of what else it's doing. She recognized it as the mountain man's version of anxiety, the body on alert because the alert was warranted, and she left him to it rather than trying to soften it into something more comfortable. They'd been home 12 days when the Crane brothers came. Not Garrett Holt, not strangers from Cheyenne. Dale and Fitch Crane, who had stood behind Holt on her porch in February and watched her hold an empty rifle without knowing it was empty. They came in the afternoon, which was either bold or stupid, and they came with no pretense of a message or a purchase agreement or anything that could be framed as reasonable. Clara saw them from the garden. She recognized Dale's horse first, a particular gray with a white sock on the left foreleg that she'd cataloged without meaning to on that first February morning when she'd been cataloging everything because everything might matter. She straightened up from the bean rows and looked toward the cabin, and Silas was already at the door. They read each other without speaking. She moved toward the cabin. He moved toward the porch. By the time the Crane brothers came up the trail, Clara was standing beside Silas on the porch, and neither of them was holding anything, which she knew from the brothers' brief hesitation was not what they'd expected. People holding nothing were harder to read than people holding weapons. Dale Crane was the older one, somewhere past 40, with a face that had spent too many years outdoors without adequate covering, and showed it. He pulled up his horse and looked at them both, and his face was doing something complicated. He'd come here with an intention, and the intention was still in there, but it was mixing with something else now, something that looked like a man who'd been told the odds were favorable and was recalculating in real time. "Mr. Crow," he said. "Dale," Silas said. He said it like a fact, like a thing that had dimensions he'd already accounted for. "We've come to talk about water," Dale said. "No, you haven't," Clara said. Dale looked at her. He'd looked at her in February without much interest, the look of a man for whom she barely registered. He was looking at her differently now, and she watched him adjust his assessment and didn't help him with it. "Mr. Holt feels," Dale started. "Mr. Holt can come up here himself if he has feelings he wants to share," Clara said. "He knows the trail. He's ridden it several times." She looked at Dale and then at Fitch, who was hanging back slightly in the way of a man who wanted to be less involved than his presence implied. "What did he actually send you to do?" Silence. "Because if you were sent to threaten us," she continued, her voice even, "I should tell you that there is an open investigation in Laramie with our names attached to it as complainants, and any incident that occurs on this property in the weeks following that investigation's opening would be examined extremely carefully by people who are already looking for reasons to examine things carefully." She paused. "And if you were sent to damage the property, specifically the water access on the eastern boundary, I should tell you that Henrik Peterson has 2 sons and 3 hired men and has been watching this trail for the past 2 weeks. This was a partial truth. Henrik's sons were real. The watching was real. The implication that anyone was currently watching the trail from a position of concealment was something she allowed them to construct on their own. Dale Crane's horse moved sideways a step. Dale brought it back. He was thinking. She could see him thinking, the slow, careful movement of a man who'd been given instructions that no longer fit the situation he'd arrived at. Fitch said something to Dale in a low voice. Clara couldn't hear the words. She watched Dale's face while he listened to them, and she watched the moment the decision changed direction. "We'll go," Dale said. "That's wise," Silas said. It was the first thing he'd said since Dale's name. He said it without emphasis, without satisfaction, just the flat acknowledgement of a correct decision correctly made. They watched the Crane brothers ride down the trail until the trees took them. Silas stood beside Clara on the porch, and neither of them moved until the sound of the horses faded out completely. "Henrik's sons aren't watching the trail," Silas said. "No," Clara agreed. "You gambled." "I calculated," she said. "There's a difference. He didn't know what we knew, and I did know what we knew, and in that gap, there was room to move." She turned toward the door. "I'm going to write to Gould today and tell him this happened." "Yes," Silas said. He followed her inside. "You were right about calculating versus gambling, by the way." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it." She stopped and looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." Gould's response to her letter came 3 weeks later, and it was the kind of letter that arrived with weight, not long, just dense, every sentence carrying more than its word count. The investigation had expanded. 3 of the families who'd previously settled with Holt's people had agreed to provide depositions, and 2 of them had documentation that Gould described, in his careful language, as significantly useful. A county official in the Eastern District had been identified as a person of interest in how Webb's filings had moved through the system without scrutiny, and Garrett Holt had retained a different attorney. Not the Laramie Fitch, someone from Cheyenne, someone expensive, which Gould noted as significant. A man retains expensive counsel when he believes what he's defending is worth defending, or when he's afraid of what he might lose. Clara read this to Silas at the table, and he listened with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes steady. "Expensive counsel means he's taking it seriously," she said. "Or that he's running out of room to not take it seriously," Silas said. "Same thing at this point." He was quiet for a moment. "What does Gould need from us now?" "He says to stay on the property, keep records of any contact, don't engage with Holt's people without a witness if possible." She folded the letter. "And he says the formal resolution on the water rights could take until spring." "Spring," Silas repeated. "Another winter," Clara said. He looked at her. Something in his face was both rueful and settled, the expression of a man who had made his peace with difficult timelines. "We've done a winter," he said. "We've done a winter," she agreed. They had, in fact, done considerably more than one winter between them, and the "we" of it had accumulated weight that the word hadn't had when she'd first started using it, back in February when she'd said it without thinking and felt it land. It was a different "we" now, tested in the specific ways that testing reveals what a thing is actually made of. Autumn came and the work of it was substantial, putting up enough food for 2, winterizing the cabin against what Silas said was going to be a hard season. He read the signs with the confidence of a man who'd been watching Wyoming weather for over a decade. The angle of the migrating birds, the behavior of the elk, the specific quality of the September cold that suggested what the January cold would be. Clara had learned to trust his readings, not because she deferred to them, but because she'd watched enough of them prove accurate to give them weight. She also built the cold storage. It was her project, entirely hers. She'd been thinking about it since early summer, the way their preservation system was inefficient, how much they were losing to spoilage that a better structure could prevent. She drew it out on brown paper, the same kind Silas had used for the map he'd drawn her in February. She showed him the drawing, and he looked at it for a long time and said, "The drainage needs to go here," pointing to the corner, "or you'll get water pooling in a wet spring." She adjusted the drawing. "Anything else?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's good." He said it matter-of-factly, like he'd assessed it properly, and the assessment was positive, and that was the whole of it, and she found she preferred this to enthusiasm. Enthusiasm was easy. Honest assessment from someone who didn't inflate things was something different. She built it over 3 weeks. Silas helped when the work required 2 people and left her to it when it didn't, which was the right balance. Her hands were wrecked by the end of it, and she got the proportions on the ventilation slightly wrong and had to redo that section, which cost her 2 days and her temper on one of them. But when it was finished, it was solid and functional, and it was hers. "It'll hold the root vegetables better than anything I've had up here," Silas said, looking at it. "That was the point," Clara said. "I know." He paused. "I'm saying it's good." "I heard you the first time," she said, but she was not unpleased, and they both knew it. The final resolution from Laramie came in March, 13 months after Garrett Holt had first pushed through her door in the gray winter dawn and told her the land reverted. It came in an envelope with the territorial seal and Gould's signature, and Clara sat at the table with Silas across from her and read it twice before she said anything. Aldous Webb had been found in violation of territorial land law on 4 counts of fraudulent claim filing. His license to operate as a land agent was revoked. He faced financial penalties that Gould described as substantial and personal liability in civil proceedings brought by 3 of the families he'd displaced. The county official who'd facilitated the filings had resigned from his position pending a separate proceeding. Garrett Holt had not been named in the criminal findings. His connection to Webb had been, as Gould put it, established in pattern but not in documentation sufficient for criminal charge. This was the part Clara had to sit with for a moment, the part that required her to separate what she wanted from what the process could deliver. Holt was not going to be charged. The man who had stood in her cabin and looked at her like a problem to be cleared had not paid a legal price in the way she'd wanted him to. But the water rights investigation had resulted in a formal declaration of the Eastern Creek's status as a protected tributary, which meant that any downstream use or diversion required territorial approval, and that approval would not be granted without the consent of the upstream landowners, meaning Clara and Silas. Meaning that what Holt had been trying to acquire for years, the thing that had made him push widows off their land and file fraudulent claims and send men with rifles to campsites, was now formally beyond his reach. Not because he'd been punished, because the door had been closed. "He doesn't get the water," Silas said. "He doesn't get the water," Claire confirmed. "And Webb is finished." "Webb is finished." Silas sat with this. He was quiet for long enough that she let him be quiet, because this was the kind of quiet she'd learned to read as processing rather than retreat. "It's not everything," he finally said. "No," she said, "it's not." "Does that—" He stopped. "Are you all right with that?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things she had feelings about. Not reaching for the answer she was supposed to have, but actually looking at what was there. She thought about Holt's face in February. She thought about the purchase agreement with the water rights clause, the deliberate predatory architecture of it, the years of other people who hadn't been able to fight back. She thought about what she'd wanted when she'd gone to Laramie the first time, which was just our land and our water and the right to stay, and she thought about what she was holding in her hands now. "Webb is done," she said slowly. "The families who settled have a civil case. The water is protected. The county official who made it easy is gone." She set the letter down. "Holt still has his cattle and his valley and his money and his large, unpleasant personality. That's true." She looked at Silas, but he tried to take something that wasn't his from a woman he thought had no way to stop him, and she stopped him. That's also true. Silas held her gaze. "You stopped him." "We stopped him," she said. "Don't do that thing where you give me all the credit as if you weren't half of every decision we made. You went to Laramie. You wrote the letter that made Laramie worth going to. You testified. You testified better than you thought you could," she said, "and the reason you could was that you practiced, and you practiced because you decided I was worth listening to, and you decided that because—" She stopped, looked at him. The gray in his beard had come a little further since winter. His face was the same face it had always been, the face that wasn't reassuring or comfortable, just honest, just present. "Because you came down the mountain with firewood when my smoke changed," she finished quietly. "That's where it started. Everything started there." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. The gesture was easier for him than it had been in February. Not fluid, not natural exactly, but deliberate in the way of a man who had decided that the things he'd unlearned could be relearned if they were worth relearning. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the creek was running loud with the first pulse of snowmelt. March in Wyoming, the season's edge, the same annual negotiation between cold and thaw that she'd watched from this cabin for over a year now. The copper ring on her finger had scratched and dulled in places from the work of the past 12 months, the building and the planting and the trail and the cold, and she'd stopped noticing it most of the time, the way you stop noticing the things that have become simply part of your hand. Done. They wrote to Roy in April. It had been Clara's idea, and it had taken her a week to decide she actually wanted to do it. Roy had not been malicious. That was still true. He had looked at her standing beside a wagon loaded with everything she and Edmund owned, and he had said the thing he'd believed, with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had cause to doubt his own assessments of women like Clara. She didn't owe him the letter. She also didn't owe herself the ongoing weight of an accounting that was never going to be settled the way she half wanted it settled. So she wrote to him. She told him they were well. She told him about the land claim and the water rights and the Laramie proceedings in enough detail that he would understand what had been navigated and by whom. She told him she had remarried. She told him that she thought Edmund would have liked Wyoming better in summer, that the mountain was very beautiful in summer, and that she wished he'd had the chance to see it that way. She did not say you were wrong about me. She didn't need to. The letter said it in the way that facts say things, without requiring the author to make the point explicitly. Silas read it before she sealed it. He handed it back without comment, which was his version of approval. She sent it with the Pedersen boy on his next run. She didn't know if Roy would write back. She found she didn't mind either outcome. And yet, summer settled over the mountain in a way that felt, for the first time, like something Clara had earned the right to witness. The garden was bigger than the first year, the cold storage full. Silas had extended the south trap line and was teaching her to read the signs of what animals left, the specific language of disturbance in grass and mud and snow that told you what had passed and when and in what direction. She was a slow student of this. It required a kind of observation she was still training her eyes for, the patience of someone who has decided to learn something that cannot be rushed. He was a better teacher than he'd been in the beginning, more willing to explain the why rather than just demonstrating and expecting her to follow. "You're more patient than you used to be," she told him one afternoon on the trail. "I'm adjusting," he said. To teaching? To someone who wants the reasoning. He said it without defensiveness. "I learned alone. I forgot that other people need the steps laid out." "Most teachers forget that," she said. "They know the thing too well to remember not knowing it." He thought about this. "Is that what it is?" "That's what it is," she said. "You have to go back to not knowing. Put yourself there on purpose and explain it from that place." He was quiet for a moment. "You think about how people learn," he said. "I think about how people work," she said. "What makes them do things and not do things? I always have. I didn't have a lot of other ways to make up for the things I didn't have." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when people have already decided what you are," she said, "when the room makes its assessment of you before you've spoken, you learn to read the room very carefully. Because you need to know what you're working with." She picked her way over a section of trail where the roots surfaced. "It's not a gift. It's just what you develop when the alternative is being blindsided constantly." "Is it still useful?" he asked. "Now." She considered it. "Differently," she said. "Before, I used it to survive rooms. Now I use it to understand people I actually care about, to know when you're working something out and I should leave you to it, to know when Henrik needs something said directly and when Astrid needs to talk until she gets to the point herself." She paused. "To know when you're about to say something that costs you something, and I should be quiet so you can find the way to it." He was silent for long enough that she thought she'd perhaps said too much. Then he said, "Like right now. Are you finding your way to something?" "I'm trying to say—" He stopped, started differently. "I was a better person before I came to this mountain. Before everything. I was someone who knew how to be around other people. And then I lost that. And I told myself it didn't matter because I didn't need it. But what I actually did was convince myself I didn't need it so that I wouldn't have to feel what I'd lost." He kept walking, eyes on the trail. "You didn't fix that. I don't want to. I'm not saying you fixed it, but you made it." He stopped again. "Possible to want it back?" she offered. He looked at her sideways. "Yes," he said. "That." She thought about what she wanted to say back. The right thing, not the easy thing. "I know what it is," she said. "To decide you don't need what you actually need because needing it and not having it is worse than just not needing it." She stepped over a root. "Edmund and I weren't. We weren't unkind to each other. But I talked myself into not needing to be fully seen because the alternative was wanting it from someone who didn't know how." And now, he said, and now I need it, she said simply. I stopped talking myself out of it. That's your fault, mostly. He made the sound that was almost a laugh, the one she'd been collecting since February. A whole season of them now. A whole year. There was an evening in late August that Clara returned to in memory for years afterward, not because anything significant happened in it, but because of the particular quality of the light and the air and the completeness of it. They were on the porch. The sun was going down behind the western ridge and throwing the kind of light that made the whole valley below look temporary and precious. The creek was audible but distant. The garden was putting out its last summer abundance, and she'd spent the afternoon putting up beans, and her hands smelled of green and brine, and she was tired in the good way, the way that means something was accomplished. Silas was beside her with the stillness he carried into all moments of rest, the quality of a man who had finally relearned how to just be somewhere without bracing against it. The copper ring caught the last of the sun. She looked at it, all its scratches and its dullness, the slight irregular shape where Silas had hammered it without quite enough skill. She thought about the fence post it had rested on, the mountain, the snow. She thought about herself standing there, the woman she'd been in that moment, hollowed out by grief and cold and weeks of making numbers come out differently than they came out, holding herself together through sheer obstinate refusal to let Garrett Holt be right. She had not known then that she was capable of what the following year would ask of her. She had not known she could build a cold storage or testify in a territorial land office, or face 3 men at a campsite in the dark, or go to Laramie twice with documents and a clear head and bring back what she went for. She had not known these things because nobody had ever given her the conditions to find them out. And she had spent so much of her life in rooms that had already decided she was decorative at best, negligible at worst, too big and too plain and too quiet to be anything that mattered. The mountain had not cared about any of that. The mountain had just asked, "Can you do the work? Can you keep going when keeping going is the only option? Can you learn what you need to learn when you need to learn it? Can you hold the door?" She had held the door. She thought about what she would say if she could say something to the woman who had stood at that window in February, watching 3 riders come up through the snow, holding an empty rifle and making the best calculation available. She would not tell her it gets easier. It didn't exactly get easier. It got different. It got larger. The hard things stayed hard, but the capacity for them expanded, and what expanded it was not courage arrived from nowhere, but the simple accumulation of hard things survived. You find out what you are by being required to be it. That was the thing nobody told you, not because they were keeping it secret, but because it couldn't be told. It could only be found the way you find things in the dark, by moving toward them with your hands out. "You're thinking again," Silas said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "This is a different kind." She looked at him. "I was thinking about what I would have told myself a year ago." "What would you have said?" She looked at the ring, then at the valley, then at the man beside her who had come down a mountain with firewood because her smoke had changed. "I would have said, 'You don't know what you are yet,'" she said. "And then I would have said, 'You're about to find out.' And I would have said," she paused, "Hold the door. Whatever you do, hold the door." Silas was quiet for a moment. The light moved and changed the way light does at the end of the day, not settling but shifting, the valley below going from gold to something deeper. "Did you know?" he asked. "When you opened the door to me, did you know it was going to go this way?" "No," she said. "Did you?" "No," he said. "I just knew your smoke had changed, and that was enough." "That was enough," he said. The evening came down over the mountain the way it always did, unhurried and complete, and Clara Whitmore Crow sat on her porch on her land with her water rights confirmed and her cold storage full and a year of hard things behind her and whatever came next ahead of her. And she was not the woman everyone had counted out. She had never been that woman. It had just taken the right conditions for everyone, including herself, to finally see it. The copper ring was warm on her finger. Below, the valley settled into dark, and somewhere in it Garrett Holt was doing whatever men like Garrett Holt did when the thing they wanted had been denied to them by someone they had fundamentally failed to understand. She found she didn't need to know. She had a porch. She had a man who had learned to hold her hand on purpose. She had a garden that had survived without her, a creek that was hers, a mountain that had asked her what she was made of and received its answer. She was made of this, all of it, every hard and unsmooth piece of it, and she was, at last, exactly where she was supposed to be.